First of all, good afternoon and welcome to everybody. My name is Anna Rufà. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at ICArEHB, and today I have the pleasure to host this third session of the ICArEHB Dialogues 2022. Today's session will focus on the migrations and dispersals in the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, and we will have two relevant speakers in this field, Dr. Maïté Rivollat and Professor Rick Schulting. About Maïté Rivollat, she is a postdoctoral researcher specializing in ancient DNA and focusing on the Mesolithic and the Neolithic in Western Europe, and she is currently based at Ghent University. After obtaining her PhD in 2016 at the Pasteur Laboratory at the University of Bordeaux in France, she conducted her first postdoctoral research with the Interact project between Pasteur Lab and the Department of Archaeogenetics of the Max Planck Institute in Jena and then in Leipzig. And her research interest involved the study of prehistoric populations at two different scales of resolution. On the one hand, she focused on the demographic processes shaping the genomics of European populations and the different interaction modalities involved, aiming to understand the equation between cultural and biological identities. And on the other hand, she is analyzing genetic structure at group level and exploring how this can inform social behavior. On the other side, we have Professor Rick Schulting, who is a professor of scientific and prehistoric archaeology at the University of Oxford. His recent and ongoing research is focusing on improving our understanding of chronology using AMS 14C dating and of paleo through the use of isotope analysis. Through his work, he has documented the rapid replacement of marine foods in coastal areas during the Mesolithic by domestic crops and animals in the Mesolithic. The recent incorporation of strontium isotopes in his analysis has also allowed him to explore mobility and landscapes used from the Mesolithic to the Bronze Age in Britain and Ireland. And in an ongoing project, he's also investigating the importance of rivers for population movements. Another of his research strands involve the reassessment of extant Neolithic skeletal collections from the point of view of interpersonal violence. And he has also extended his interest to Eurasian steppe pastoralists and the hunter-gatherers of Siberia and northern Japan as a member of the Baikal Archaeological Project. Both the speakers will talk about how to study the mobility of human populations in recent prehistory from two different points of view. We will start with Maïté talking about ancient DNA and human mobility during recent prehistory. And then Rick will talk about different scales and kinds of human interactions during the Mesolithic and the Neolithic. Rick's talk will follow directly after Maïté's, and after watching both talks, we will have a question and answer session to create a dialogue between two speakers who have both joined us via Zoom. And for the audience, if you have questions for either specialist, please write the questions in the group chat box, and I will call on individuals to ask their questions after the talks. Please make sure to send all the questions to everyone in the chat to make sure that they are read. So thank you again to our speakers to enjoy these talks, and here you are.
Hi everyone, I am Maïté Rivollat, and I am going to talk to you about ancient DNA in the frame of these dialogues about migrations and dispersals, the Mesolithic and the Neolithic. So I'm going to stop the camera for you to see the full PowerPoint, but see you later for the discussion. So I am going to discuss about human ancient DNA and how they give insights into ancient population, biological constitution, and evolution. And I am going to focus on two different levels of analysis. And the first one will be the big picture. So basically to discuss the modalities of interaction, migrations, or demographic dynamics, thanks to ancient DNA. So my research is focusing on Mesolithic and Neolithic in Western Europe. And for that, I'm going to show you first what ancient DNA taught us the last 2 decades. So let's start with this PCA, which is the most classic way for us to look at our data. And here you can see the modern viability of Western Eurasia. So each dot represents one individual, and it is based on 600,000 SNPs, so different genomic marker. So first of all, you can observe a pattern linked to the geography of modern Europe. So you have Caucasus individuals here and going with a gradient to the Near East here, another gradient linking Northeastern Europe to Southwestern Europe. And here we have a bridge between Southeastern Europe, for Southeastern European individuals, linking the two different gradients. So this is for the modern data. When we plot on the top of this our ancient data, and if we start with the hunter-gatherers only, so I'm talking about Mesolithic individuals only, I'm not talking about earlier groups because they are quite different genetically, and I'm not going to speak about them today. So first you can see that they don't overlap with the variability that we know today. So these hunter-gatherers, they are carrying one component that we are going to call today hunter-gatherer component, but we are going to look at this a bit more in detail and see that there is actually a structure. So amongst these Mesolithic individuals, we now know that there is two main clusters, one in Western Europe and one in Eastern Europe. And there is a gradient in between, which is geographically consistent of Scandinavian and Southeastern individuals that are on this climb. We also have another cluster that is here called Goya Q2 because it's linked to a Magdalenian individual, a Magdalenian group. And this genetic cluster is different also from what we know later. And it kind of stayed alive in the Iberian refugium during the last glacial maximum, and we keep seeing it later on in the later periods. So we are going to go back to this. But what's important now is that this structure between Western and Eastern Europe is visible on this PCA, and our individuals are spanning along this gradient. So if we go back to this PCA and we look at the first farmers appearing in the southeastern Mediterranean area, we see that we have two different clusters also for the Levant and for the Anatolia. So we know now that these two clusters are different, and we can absolutely clearly see that they are not linked at all to these hunter-gatherers. So if we were wondering for centuries, or at least 1.5 centuries, how the diffusion of the Neolithic happened, if it was via human migrations or via cultural diffusion, we now know, thanks to the DNA, that people carried this diffusion. And we are going to look at that in detail. So if we look at the first ancient Neolithic farmers in Europe, we see that they overlap with the Anatolian individuals, but not at all with the Natufians and the pre-Pottery Neolithic. So it is quite clear that the diffusion happening in Europe came from the Anatolia. You can see here on the plot on the right that this orange component that we call Anatolian components, showing the very early proxy of a Neolithic component, let's say, is taking over almost all the profile of the early Neolithic individuals. But we still have a bit of this blue component, so this hunter-gatherer component, because we have a bit of admixture. So again, we are going to look at that a bit more in detail. And the more we go through time, and the more we see that Neolithic individuals are shifting toward the left here. So they are actually, there is an increasing of hunter-gatherer components in the genomes of these individuals during the Middle Neolithic times, mostly all over Europe. And we can see here that the blue component, the component of this hunter-gatherer ancestry, is increasing through time. And I'm going to show you quickly what happened later, even if it's not our interest today, but to explain the composition of the modern DNA of Europeans, we see here that this Yamnaya's individual, so from the Eurasian steppes, that appear as a completely different cluster again because of a different genetic ancestry, and by mixing with the Neolithic individuals in Europe, they actually create this Bronze Age genomic profile that we can still find today with the composition of the three main components. So from the hunter-gatherers, the Anatolia, farmers, and the steppe pastoralist. But let's go to our topic, which is the actual Neolithic diffusion in Western Europe. This is what I'm working on, and so now I'm going to present to you a paper that we published some time ago with my colleagues from Germany and France, mainly. And so for this study, we targeted 12 sites spanning from the Mesolithic with Bad Dürrenberg and Bottendorf in Germany, and going to the late Middle Neolithic. So we have sites from south of France, from the LBK region, from different area in France, from the Middle Neolithic. And we are going to see how they can help to explain the Neolithic diffusion at the genetic level. So first, a very quick insight into the method and the strategy we used. So we built our libraries and we observed in there how much endogenous DNA we obtain for each individual. So you can see here on this plot the percentage of this endogenous DNA for each individual, and you can see a very high variability in the DNA preservation between sites, but also within sites. So this percentage of endogenous DNA is important for us because it determines a strategy we can apply then. So one possibility that we have would be to sequence deeper each library, and therefore to obtain a certain amount of DNA that we could analyze. But this method would require that we have a good enough preservation of the DNA that we set around 10%, because below this limit, it would not be cost efficient at all to get exploitable data. So you can see here that this threshold is not passed by a lot of individuals. So we decided to go for another method, which is targeting a specific set of SNPs, so of position of interest. So in our case, 1.2 million. And this method, by targeting only specific regions in the genome, allow to analyze even low preserved or badly preserved individuals. And the threshold for this capture is set at 0.1% of endogenous DNA. So for our data set, we could apply this capture to almost all the individuals of the data set. And you can see here the number of SNPs so that we could obtain out of these 1.2 million. And in average, we have 400,000 SNPs covered, which is quite good and definitely good enough to analyze them and compare them with their published data. So if we go back to this PCA again, this is the data published before our paper. And so you can find again, you can see again the structure amongst the hunter-gatherers here. And here, the two clusters formed by the ancient European Neolithic individuals and the Middle Neolithic individuals. But it's not only about time, it's also about geography. So you can see here that this cluster is mainly composed by Central European individuals and Southeastern individuals. And this other one is composed by mostly Western individuals. And this is because of a different amount of hunter-gatherer component mainly. So we are going to look at this a bit more in details. So if we plot on the top of this new data, we can observe different things. So first, the hunter-gatherers that we obtain from Germany do cluster with the Western hunter-gatherer, which is expected. So it's a good news. The LBK individuals also plot with the Southeastern and Central European farmers, which is also expected and fit what we knew so far. And for the Middle Neolithic, the French farmer also cluster with Western European farmers. So far, so good. But what we can see, and which is quite striking, is these individuals from southern France from the early Neolithic. So these should, we were expected them to fit more with the early Neolithic from Iberia, for instance, here, but they are not, and they are much more shifted towards the hunter-gatherers. So if we look at them a bit more into detail, you can see here the proportion of Anatolian component in orange and the hunter-gatherer component in blue. And we can see that some of them go up to 55% of European hunter-gatherer component, which is a lot and not observed so far. So for this individual in particular, coming from Bendimun, and that woman is called Bendimun F2, she is dated about the mid of the 6th millennium. And we could estimate the admixture event, and we dated it back to 4 to 6 generations. So meaning about 100 to 150 years in the past that she first got this admixture event in her history. But to get such a high amount of hunter-gatherer component, this admixture needs to be continuous contact. It cannot be just one single event 6 generations before, because it would be completely diluted, and it is not. So we can see here, genetically speaking, that we had a contact between hunter-gatherers and farmers for at least a century in the region. But if we look at the archaeological data, there is no evidence of direct contact in the region. So here you have the snapshot of the hunter-gatherers and farmer sites known around this period. And we can see that there is no hunter-gatherer or Mesolithic sites in the area. So if we don't have any sites reliably dated, we still can see archaeological evidence of coexistence. So we know they were around each other, but they were avoiding each other. So we have different hypotheses to explain the data. The admixture could have happened locally, but the archaeological findings are deficient for different reasons, maybe taphonomy, maybe research strategy, or maybe because they are not existing. And or it could be that because the admixture happened recently elsewhere, maybe eastwards, that would fit the archaeological hypothesis that could be happening in the Tosco-Emilian Apennine or in the Po Plain. So we do need more data to understand what happens in this region and to get a better resolution at the regional level. And this is in progress in the continuity of our project. And if we go back to the structure that we talked about before, about the main genetic cluster that we know during the Mesolithic, so before the farmers arrive, you can see here on this map that we can see the different clusters. So this map is showing all the individuals present in Europe for a long period of time before, so all the beginning of the Holocene, before the farmers arrived. So we can see in blue all the Western hunter-gatherer individuals. In green, this component inherited from this Magdalenian related ancestry. And in purple, we have this Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry, which is partly admixed in the Iron Gates hunter-gatherers here. And if we look at the diffusion of the Neolithic, so again in orange with this Anatolian component, we can see the spread of it, and we can see different things. So first, this Mesolithic genetic background is still visible in the Neolithic individual. So here in the southeast of Europe, they have this purple component, this Eastern hunter-gatherer-like component. We can see in the rest of Western Europe blue component, meaning the Western hunter-gatherer component, and we can see in different individuals from Iberia here that we keep this little Magdalenian-related ancestry. But we have a few things to observe that actually are showing us where the admixture took place. For instance, here in central Germany, for the very first Neolithic individuals, the LBK, we can see that some of them still have this Eastern hunter-gatherer component, which is not here in the local background. And so this means that this admixture happened before, earlier, along the route that the Neolithic farmers took to come to Western Europe. And we also can observe in general this very important diversity of processes. So again, with this huge amount of hunter-gatherer component in southeastern France, and the difference between the different areas of this impresocardial culture in South Europe, where we have in some regions of it no admixture, and some others a lot. So what we can see with this big picture is that so far the exponential increase of data in ancient DNA mainly gave insights into population mobility at the continental level and highlighted the high regional diversity that we keep exploring with the increasing of the data. But also in the recent years, the development of an analytical method and the increase in data have made it possible to explore also more local scales. And that's what I'm going to talk about now, by exploring more questions about group structures, networks, population sites, and also social insights. So I'm now going to present a paper that just came out a few weeks ago about a site in Normandy from the Middle Neolithic period called Fleury-sur-Orne. So we are talking about Passy type monument site. I'm going to explain that a bit more. Under a Cerny cultural horizon with a very local specificity. So here you have a map of all these Cerny geographical spread, let's say, sorry. And we have all the Paris Basin here is really well known for big monument called structure de type Passy or Passy type monument, which are very long mounds like this with a lot of individuals buried in there. So males, females, children. and they are quite well known in the region. And then we have in Normandy, we have several sites, 2 here on the map, but 2 others have been detected by Aryan survey, where we have another kind of monuments, like in Fleury-sur-Orne. So in this site, we also have really long monuments, but buried mainly for a single individual, rarely 2. We could observe 19 individuals from the Neolithic times in there, but they have a very bad macroscopic preservation. So for the DNA analysis, we could analyze 15 of them. So according to the same process, we build the libraries and we observed how much endogenous DNA we get. And again, you can see that only one individual here is above this limit of 10% of endogenous DNA. So we also again applied the capture method. So first of all, let's talk about the sex determination. So the osteological sex could have been assigned only for 4 individuals because of the really bad preservation of the bones, and all were male. And based on some artifacts found in the graves, so-called the arrowheads, which are really well known in the Paris Basin and exclusively associated to males. So all the individuals in Fleury-sur-Orne, because this site belongs to the same culture, so 7 individuals with arrowheads has been assigned as male based on the archaeological data. And then we got the genetic sex, and out of the 14 individuals for which we got genomic data, 13 were males and 1 was female. And so this is showing the power of the male elite. So we have these huge monuments built for a single individuals and mainly males, but we also have this female, and surprise, this female has some arrowheads in the grave. So our hypothesis here is that the embodiment of the male gender in death seemed to have been necessary for her, for that only female to access to burial in these huge structures. So this is showing how the site is built around this male figure. Now we had a look at the biological relatedness between individuals, and what we could find is that only 2 pairs are related to each other at the 1st degree relationship, meaning either way siblings or father-son, because it's only males involved in this kinship. And we know it's father-son because none of them are sharing the same mitochondrial DNA. So we don't know who is the father with the son, but we know this is a father-son relationship. And we have absolutely no biological relatedness or close relatedness between monuments. And in the case of the monument 8, we can see that it has been extended for to host the 2nd burial in there. So we have a proper will to keep together these 2 individuals. So we can observe here a strong patrilineality inside the funerary structures. And as there is no link in between, we propose that this necropolis is gathering masculine leaders from different communities. So then now the question becomes, what are we talking about when we talk about communities? What scale is it? Are we exploring? So one thing to know is that in the region there is no household, no settlements, no buildings linked to the living of the individuals. We just have these big funerary sites, so we don't know anything about the dispersal of this, but we can have or explore this through the genetic data. So first of all, if we look at the PCA again and how these individuals in Fleury are behaving in there, we can see that they are fitting quite well within the expected diversity of the, so here of the Western European Middle Neolithic individuals, except 2 outliers, but this can be explained for the reason that they are much more recent, that the more recent individuals buried in the site. We also have a third one here, really recent as well, but we don't have DNA enough, not well preserved enough to be analyzed. And so these 2 individuals have apparently been reusing the monuments afterwards. So among these first, the first users of the site, we were exploring the ROH, or runs of homozygosity, which is a kind of index to show us the inbreeding of the group. So basically, these are fragments that are similar that are the same in both chromosomes. And so it is because they are inherited from both parents, because these parents are somehow related. So the longer the ROH are, the closer the parents are to each other. So it gives us information about inbreeding of the population, but also about population size, because if you have a small population size, you have more chance that your parents are somehow related to each other. So you have 2 examples here, often first on the left of the different hunter-gatherer groups, which are much smaller population size. And here, the Anatolian and some Germany LBK farmers, which have a much bigger population, and so very short or no ROH. And so if we look at Fleury's data, we see that we don't have very long ROH, but we have some background relatedness in there. So it means that these people knew that how to avoid any inbreeding in there, but also that the population size was not that big. And so see, if we look at this, at the level of the affinity between the individuals, we can see on this plot. So basically the bigger is the value here, the closer the individuals are to each other. So we see that all the Fleury-sur-Orne individuals here are closer to each other. You see they are above the median line than they are to some other regional or extra-regional individuals. So this means, in a more simple way, that all the individuals from Fleury have a higher within-group affinity than between distinct regional groups, showing that they were working inside a regional network. So it doesn't give us clear insight about functioning of the whole system, but we have some clue about the size of the network in which they were working, which is quite local, quite regional. So to conclude about that, the exploration of local scale genomic diversity in regards with archaeological context gives new insights about local structures and regional network. And it's going to be explored much more in the coming years, because we can all see the potential of such analysis. And by combining with other data analysis like isotopes, as Rick is going to talk to you about right now, this opens to new possibilities of interpretations and understanding of the past societies. So I thank you for your attention, and let's discuss about that in a moment.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this dialogue on migrations and dispersals in the Mesolithic and the Neolithic of Europe. My cover slide shows a classic image from Lou Binford's work amongst the Nunanumut of Western Alaska, which emphasizes the high mobility of both individuals and communities over very large expanses of the landscape. And I think this and other studies have really influenced our understandings of hunter-gatherer mobility. But is this always the case? So Hugh Brody in The Other Side of Eden refers to a paradox. He writes, "The profound dichotomy that has shaped the agricultural era may lie in an opposition between nomads and settlers. While we may think that he's referring to hunter-gatherer nomads and farmer settlers, in fact, the paradox is that this is a divide between settled hunters and the nomadic farmers." So he's writing in the context of his work amongst Indigenous communities in northern Canada, in which they are seen as increasingly marginalized and pushed out of their territories by the ongoing expansion, it still continues today, of Europeans with a farming way of life. So his work characterizing the hunting territories of Daneza, Athabascan-speaking peoples in northeastern British Columbia, emphasized the degree to which, for many generations, people use the same hunting territories. So here's a composite image from hunters of the Doig River Band, showing how much they overlap with one another, but yet are distinct from the hunting territories of surrounding bands. And while we see that there is some overlap between the territories of these the bands shown here, this is largely individual hunters who have relatives in one band or another that allow them to use that hunting territory. So despite that, you can still see that there's some of these territories are very exclusive, in fact. So other aspects of this paradox are that many hunter-gatherer communities have origin myths, placing them as having been forever in the place they are now. And this can bring them into conflict with archaeologists who might refer, for example, to the peopling of North America as a process that began with communities in Northeast Asia crossing the Bering Straits and coming to people the Americas, whereas a First Nations perspective in Canada would be that the people have always been there. In contrast, many farming communities have origin myths located elsewhere, combined with either vague or highly specific and detailed migration myths or histories. So on the left-hand side here, we see a monumental sculpture in cedar by artist Bill Reid, who is half Haida and half Scottish, and it recounts the myth of Raven and the First People, where Raven came along a beach on Haida Gwaii, opened a clamshell that he found, and the first Haida people emerged. So they were born on Haida Gwaii, and they've always been there. The middle image refers to the story of creation, where God said unto the people, "Be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth." So this is an explicit command to spread, to extend, to disperse across the landscape. And this is not unique to farming societies. We see this in many other places in the world. So in the Middle Sepik of Papua New Guinea, for example, this knotted cord is a mnemonic device that is used to recount the travels of a particular clan from their ancestral home to the village in which they now find themselves. And the knots on this make reference to very specific places on the landscape that were encountered during that journey. So it's very much a story of migration. So while we often may describe hunter-gatherers as being highly mobile and farmers as sedentary, hunter-gatherers often inhabit territories that are stable over centuries or millennia, while farmers rapidly spread across much of Europe. And so this image here is from classic study by Ammerman and Cavalli-Sforza, 1971, showing the demic diffusion or wave of advance out of Southwest Asia occurring in a time-transgressive fashion as farmers moved across Europe. Of course, this went very much out of fashion in the following decades, but it's now very much back on the agenda thanks to the work of ancient DNA that we will refer to later, and obviously also Maïté will talk about as well. So stepping back from that for a moment, We can also investigate this question of territories and dispersals in different ways. Now, territories are, depending on the scale we view them at, are in a way the opposite of dispersal, because these are places where people keep doing the same things on the landscape. And we'll come back to some of these points. But material culture, so-called style zones, was one of the early ways of investigating this. So here's just some examples of the kinds of style zones that have been found in Western Europe in the Mesolithic. This is work I pulled together over a decade ago now. And what it shows is at different scales, and quite often marked by physical boundaries, there are these borders on which different things are done on either side. So, for example, the English Channel, or La Manche, is divided in the late Mesolithic in continental Europe, groups using trapeze armatures, whereas in Britain, there is a continuation of what in the rest of Europe would have been considered an outdated middle Mesolithic technology relying on geometric microliths. So this coincides with the final drowning of Doggerland and the creation of the English Channel. So a boundary is created, physical boundary, but it's not one by any means that's insurmountable. This is a relatively easy crossing, and indeed people make it on a daily basis today in small watercraft. We see a similar one either side of the Irish Sea, where in Ireland, they, in the late Mesolithic, turned to a macro blade technology, including so-called bandflakes, that's very, very different from the geometric microliths that were in use even a short distance across in Western Scotland, for example. And there's very few examples of crossover. So while these communities must have been aware of each other, both in the case of those bordering the Irish Sea and also across the Channel, there was either that contact was very limited and sporadic, or there was a choice made not to adopt those technologies. Those were something that other people did. So there's some sort of social boundary emerging here. And we can see these on different scales. Just another example at a large scale would be the River Seine. Again, a physical boundary, but not one that cannot be crossed. And yet on the north-hand side of the River Seine, people were retouching their blades on the right-hand side. Their armatures were being retouched in a very particular way. Whereas to the south, on the left-hand bank of the Seine, they retouched them on the left-hand side. There's no functional reason to do this one way or the other. This is purely a matter of learned traditions. And yet these must have persisted for centuries for us to identify them as archaeologists. They're not mutually exclusive, so you do get some crossover, but it's very limited, and that these are exceptions that prove the rule. And this has been recognized for many decades. On a slightly smaller scale, the River Vilaine in Brittany divides Retzian technologies from Tevecian technologies to the north. Tevik and Hudik are shown here, and we'll come back to those two sites shortly. So moving further north to the west coast of Norway, we have stone axes that made use of two different types of raw materials, diabase and greenstone. And if we zoom in on that, we have a very nice distribution map here showing the distribution of these two sources and the axes made of those materials rather. And it's true that the diabase source is in the north. This is the identified quarry of that material. And the greenstone source that has been identified is to the south. But yet those materials expanded out from those quarry sites for well over 100 kilometers in either direction. But yet where they meet, not quite equidistant between the two sources, in what is marked zone 5 here, there is a very sharp boundary. And we can see that quantified by the little inset plot here with the vertical axis showing the number of axes of each material, and how in zone 5, and indeed to the zones either side of that in 5 or 6, there's very, very little overlap in the two raw materials. And again, we have to envisage this being in place for many centuries to be visible archaeologically. So these weren't changing fashions in the use of one material or the other. These were a very strong boundary and a border that some people have even talked about as possibly marking an ethnic division and maybe a language border as well. We can see something similar moving a little bit further south to Denmark and southern Sweden, where Limham type stone axes are found in quite large numbers on Zealand, in eastern Denmark, and also on adjacent Scania. Whereas in the west, we have T-shaped antler axes, and there's very, very little overlap in these two materials and ways of doing things on either side of that boundary, which pretty much is marked by the Storebælt. Zooming in on eastern Denmark and the island of Zealand, we can see an even finer level of division between the 4 different corners of the island, showing slightly different ways of making stone axes that again must have persisted over centuries to be visible today. The images on the right show healed cranial fractures, and myself and other researchers have suggested that one of the ways we might think of these is in the context of territorial disputes. So those are just some examples. We have abundant evidence for the existence of these style zones. Sometimes they're in ways of doing things, ways of making tools. In other times they are in raw materials. But what do these style zones mean? Are they social territories? Some may be, but many are far too large for this. So we cannot usefully think of Britain as having some sort of single community, even though they share the use of geometric microliths for the late Mesolithic, in contrast to other communities using trapezes in the west of Europe. It just doesn't make sense to think of it on that scale. Similarly, the right-hand lateralization on the north bank of the River Seine continues all the way to the North Sea. And that's far too large an area to think of as encompassing a social territory in any useful sense of that term. And furthermore, these style zones and uses of raw materials may cross-cut and overlap in different ways, depending on what particular aspects of the material culture that we're looking at. So it might be better to think of these style zones as marking exchange networks that happen on very different scales, some very large, but these might only reflect very intermittent communication and contact between widely dispersed communities. So we need another way of looking at this that brings it down more to the level of the lived human lifetime. And I think stable isotopes are one way of doing this. So stable carbon and nitrogen isotopes reflect certain aspects of diet over a very long term. If we're measuring adult bone collagen, which is usually what we measure for this kind of analysis, we are getting an average of the foods consumed over about the last 10 years of a person's life. So this provides a very different approach to that of the material culture style zones. This focuses instead on intimately shared foodways within communities. And we can talk about diet zones when we can find groups of individuals that are more similar to one another than another group of individuals at some spatial remove. So one of the first time I came across this was with work that Mike Richards and I did on Tevik and Hudik a couple of decades ago now. So these are 2 cemeteries in the south of Brittany that are only some 30 kilometers apart, and yet their stable carbon and nitrogen isotopes, when considered together, are pretty much non-overlapping. And again, these reflect long-term diets for both the individuals, but also by implication for the communities over many centuries, because that's the extent over which these cemeteries were in use. So this is a very different picture from the kind of large-scale mobility that Lou Binford and Hugh Brody was talking about in a very different context, right? These were hunter-gatherers in Alaska and in northeast British Columbia, which is a boreal forest zone in the second case, and hunting territories need to be much larger in those cases. So this is a much richer coastal environment that we're talking about now in Brittany, and the territories of these communities could be much smaller, and I think that's what we're seeing. And we see this in various other places in Western Europe. So here's an example from northern Spain, where we see relatively more scattered human remains found at various sites, but pulling them together, we see that remains found near the coast, individuals found near the coast, share reasonably strong marine diets. Maybe about, if we want to put a number on it, perhaps about half of the diet comes from marine foods. Whereas very short distances inland of that, sometimes less than 10 kilometers or so, in the case of Las Canas in the foothills of the Picos de Europa, we see very strongly terrestrial diets. And this has only been reaffirmed recently by sequential work on tooth dentine that shows a lack of so this is on sub-annual resolution now, and yet we don't see the short-term use of marine resources that might be covered in sort of bulk analysis of bone collagen. So one more example for the Mesolithic, in this case from the Sado Valley of southern Portugal, where Eric Gary and colleagues did a very nice study showing this very, very strong division, again, with a couple of exceptions that we'll come to, mutually exclusive, non-overlapping distributions of diets from the lower Sado near the coast, which emphasize more marine and terrestrial resources, compared to diets from sites in the upper Sado, which emphasize much more terrestrial foodways and subsistence practices. And the division between these two groups of sites occurs on a spatial scale that is less than 10 kilometers. So this is quite striking. People are not, and yet we think of rivers as corridors of movement, right? And yet there are also boundaries in this case. There's a very strong line there. There are exceptions of people crossing it. So we see here two individuals highlighted in green that have what we can call lower Sado diets. So they're emphasizing more estuarine foods, and yet the individuals were found in sites in the upper Sado. So that is movement, but it's on an individual scale. And the overall territories, the diet zones, remain very distinctive. So it's not to say that we don't see this in the Neolithic. It's perhaps a little bit harder to find because of the overwhelming reliance on exclusively terrestrial resources, which by and large look the same. So you have to have some pretty exceptional circumstances or something very interesting going on, either ecologically or in terms of subsistence practices, to be able to distinguish these. And here's a case where we see exactly that from the early Neolithic of Western Ireland and County Clare. There's two monumental chamber tombs, Parknabeena and Palnabrone, which show, again, non-overlapping stable isotope values, in this case, especially in stable nitrogen isotopes. So they show very different diets. The sites are only about 10 kilometers apart. Again, they overlap in time over centuries. And yet there is no sense that these communities were sharing people back and forth, whether that's in marriage partners or other kinds of movements. These communities were remaining quite distinct. Other isotopes can give us slightly different insights. So strontium refers to the bedrock in the area that you were growing up in while your tooth was forming. So the analysis is done on dental enamel. And we can see here in a study by Dusan Boric and Doug Price in the Iron Gates of Serbia and Romania, we have a whole series of Mesolithic individuals going back to 9000 BC that are consistent with the local range that you'd expect for individuals from the Iron Gates, shown in gray on the plot. And the picture changes very strongly at around 6200 BC, where all of a sudden we have the appearance of a range of individuals that are either above the local range or there's one below it. And this coincides with the appearance of the Neolithic. So this is a really nice study showing that it's it's only with the Neolithic that you get these incomers. So this implies this dispersal and mobility in the Iron Gates appearing with the Neolithic, not present in the preceding millennia of the Mesolithic. And we see similar results elsewhere in Neolithic sites. So this is just a single chamber tomb in Wales dating to the early 4th millennium BC. And we find some individuals that are outside of what we would expect for the local range. Some of them, it's suggested they could be from quite far distant. So we're seeing, this mobility in farmers. And we also see this in late Neolithic cremations at Stonehenge. So this is work that Christoph Snook and colleagues and myself did a few years ago now on the cremated remains that were found in one of the Aubrey holes, re-excavated by Mark Parker Pearson and his team. And about a third of the individuals that were analysed are not consistent with coming from the chalk on which Stonehenge sits. So that's the local environment. We have measurements on modern plants from the chalk and also modern plants from West Wales. And we can see that a number of the individuals from Stonehenge have higher, more radiogenic values consistent with those from plants growing in West Wales, so consistent with that geology. Now, they would also be consistent with various other places in Britain, or indeed further abroad, but the connection with West Wales gains more currency because of the quarrying of the bluestones that we know came from the Preseli Hills of West Wales and were brought to Stonehenge. And so that provides a material connection that we argued in this paper makes that the more likely source of individuals that were found at Stonehenge. And on a larger scale again, this is going back to the demic diffusion, but on much firmer footing. So this is the work of ancient DNA by Maïté in this case and colleagues, showing the orange is the strong or the Anatolian farming ancestry, and we can see how that spreads across Europe, basically largely replacing the indigenous hunter-gatherer ancestry. And again, there's some return of that after around 4000 BC that's quite interesting. So there's maybe some mobility on that side of things as well. But overwhelmingly, at first glance, this is a story of the migration of farmers in a way that's kind of reminiscent of what Hugh Brodie was talking about with the European colonization of North America. So that broad picture now seems quite clear, and it's really interesting where ancient DNA is heading now in terms of teasing out more fine detail. And so just as a single example, here's a study by Lara Cassidy and colleagues in Ireland. And in particular, we see the famous site of Newgrange shown here. And one of the highlights of their study was the finding of an individual in the Newgrange tomb that was the product of an incestuous relationship between a brother and a sister. So the DNA really pointed in that direction. But from my perspective, what I'd like to point out, and this is the crossing lines between the red symbols in the lower right, is that there were a series of individuals in quite far-flung Neolithic monuments all the way to the west of Ireland and further north into the northeast of Ireland that shared quite close familial relationships, suggesting that these communities were in quite close connections, exchanging marriage partners, possibly in the context of something like elite lineages. So just to wrap up, I think I've sort of touched upon a series of what I would call old and new tools. We have this traditional way of looking at connections and contacts in material culture style zones. We have what I've suggested as a more sort of intimate approach in looking at what I call diet zones using stable isotopes. And then we have the operation on different scales, both very broad but also quite intimate scales, being provided by ancient DNA. And these are all complementary sources of information on different scales and different kinds of human interaction. You can imagine learning how to do something by watching somebody. You can imagine sharing meals, and you can imagine marriage and the production, children that are produced from the offspring that are produced from these. These are all different kinds and scales of human interaction that we are now having an increasingly refined toolkit, a set of analytical tools to go about investigating these at different scales. And I think this is quite exciting. We do need to think more about how to integrate these different lines of evidence and how to interpret them, maybe with a little bit more nuance than sometimes has been the case. And this implies both to material culture, to isotopes, and to DNA. And I think improvements are being made in all of these areas to think about what are the mechanisms that underlie the kinds of things that we're seeing. So with that, I look forward to our discussion. I would like to thank the organizers of the dialogues and to my colleague in the discussion, Maïté. And I'll just end with showing some of the references for my talk. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Rick and Maïté, for these two incredible talks. Now it's time for questions. We already have some questions on the chat. Hugo, if you want to go first.
Yes, that was what it's written. Just I was wondering if if they're all adults, the skeletons recovered at this particular cemetery, or if there were any children.
It's only adults there. In the Paris Basin, we have children, but not in Fleury. And so it might be because we just haven't found them. But for what we know in the skeleton records, we don't have any. So we cannot talk about this inherited status, at least not with the children.
Do you know if in the Paris Basin, any of the children you could determine by genetics if they were related to any of the adults, or?
We don't have genetic DNA.
All from that context.
Basin,
okay, that's fine.
Yeah, in the Paris Basin, we have children with arrowheads, for instance. So the archaeologists think that that's an inherited status. And what's interesting is that the arrowheads have not been used at all. So it's really an artifact of prestige there. But not in Fleury. In Fleury, we don't have that. So
because it's quite curious if in Fleury, two of the individuals were father and son. So it implies that at least they were living to a certain age, right? So at least
for those accessing to this site, at least.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we have two more questions from James too. James, if you want to show up. I don't know if he's here, maybe.
Sorry. Yeah. I was just wondering if there was any Yamnaya ancestry in those Fleury individuals.
No, it's too early. The Yamnaya ancestry is coming later, around the 3000 BC, and the individuals in Fleury are around 4500 BC, roughly. So no, it's not the different. It's not the same. Time period and cultural.
No, it was just because of the arrowhead. So these were hunter-gatherers then?
No, they were Neolithic. They are Neolithic, but they have arrowheads anyways. And specifically in the Cerny culture, in this culture around this area at that time, they have a strong link to this wild world, as it's called. And more in the Paris Basin, the fauna remains are more almost exclusively from wild animals. Wild fauna. It's not the case in Fleury, so we have some differences there, but there is a strong wild component in this culture. But
okay, so the arrowheads couldn't have been, because farming doesn't imply arrowheads. So
no, but it doesn't mean they were not hunting at all, and it's more. Yeah, and it's not. Maybe it's not linked to the hunting. Actually, maybe it's linked to some.
No, that's why I was asking, because of the Yamnaya, because they would definitely use arrowheads. But I mean, farming doesn't imply arrowheads. So whose arrowheads were those?
Farmers kill animals. Farmers today shoot. They hunt. This is something. Sometimes you're protecting your crops, and sometimes you just do it for some extra meat, so you don't have to kill one of your cattle because they're more valuable.
But since they were elites, supposedly, so were the elites like hunters with arrowheads?
Are there signs of violence between the Neolithic communities? Like, were the arrowheads related to infighting, or?
Not in the specific ones, but it's a period where we do have some violence. A bit later, it's getting much more present. We have a lot of like overkill sites in more eastern sites in French area, for instance. It's not so well known in the Cerny culture, but why not? I think we have one arrowhead located in the hip bones for one of the individuals in Fleury, but it doesn't mean it has been killed like this or got injured like this, but and what's is interesting is that, so in Fleury that's not possible to do that, but in the Paris Basin we have much more individuals, and some osteological analysis have been conducted on the shoulder, and they found some marks of like bone adaptation to some specific effort on the right side from these males associated to our heads. So meaning they were actually using some bow for what, I don't know, but they were. But we cannot observe that in Fleury because bones are so badly preserved. So.
Also, James is asking about possible differences of genetic ancestry within individuals with different diet zones. I don't know if you want to add some other comments.
Yes, I was asking if especially the Sado ones, since they were separated, were they different genetic ancestry, or were they closely related genetically?
Yeah, unfortunately, with all the examples of the diet zones that I used isotopically, I don't think we are at the level yet where we have DNA at all, or at enough detail, enough resolution to do those sorts of close relationships. I don't know, Maïté, if you know if anyone.
I don't think so. I don't think we have data for these ones. But one area that Rick you talked about is the iron gates, and I think there it's a really nice case where we have at the same time genetic data, isotopic data, and of course cultural data. And I remember a presentation I saw some years ago in an early Neolithic conference in Spain, and they were presenting a very nice chronology, and we can see the local individuals, the incoming individuals with different diet signal and maybe strontium signal, I'm not sure. And then genetically we see the admixture happening, and the first generation have the local diet, if I remember well. So in that case, it's just like an amazing situation where we have all our different approaches coming together and getting a very great snapshot of a community at one deep point. And I'm hoping we will go there in the coming years. That would be awesome.
Fantastic.
We have another question. I imagine it's not your name, Dragpar, if you want to show up and ask your question yourself. If not, we are going to read it.
Hi, I think this is me. I don't. Yeah, hello. Greetings from Durham. Hi, Rick. I don't know how to change my identifier on Zoom, so I'm afraid DRK0PAR is all you get. Now, I was going to make two small points. One is that, which I put in the chat, farmers everywhere across Europe have arrowheads of different sorts. And in Britain, the leaf-shaped arrowhead seems to be for use on each other. It's not for hunting or anything like that. It's actually for shooting other people. So farmers are entirely allowed to have arrowheads. They are just as unpleasant as anybody else might care to be. But I was really interested in Rick's presentation about small areas of diet or whatever in the coastal regions. I mean, that contrast with your Canadian and Inuit groups is exactly what you would expect if you look at the ethnography. Those little Danish flake axe groups, the areas they cover are exactly the same size as the little inbreeding units in places like the Northwest Coast and so on. So what you may well have is a small unit of a few hundred people, owner occupying their particular bits of territory, hence the kind of bangs on the head and all the rest of it that we saw. So the prediction would be that they were mostly breeding within themselves and not across their boundaries. So for people like Maïté, for example, go for it. That's where you should be seeing local little DNA variations. I'd be really intrigued to see that. Oh, and one tragic thing, only 3 or 4 years ago, I published a paper arguing that people moved all the way up and down the Sardo. I guess that got blown out of the water, Rick, didn't it? Sorry, oh well. The best ideas we
They
have.
could have been moving, they just weren't stopping to have snacks on the way.
Well, anyway, that's me done. Thank you.
Thanks. No, I agree entirely. And one thing I'm very interested in is these estimates of effective population size with the runs of homozygosity, because there are very strong predictions for these kinds of small, what seem to be very small, bedded in populations, and they should be, I think, quite small. And the contrast that you showed, Maïté, between most of your Mesolithic runs of homozygosity and most of the Neolithic ones, I mean, that was night and day. And it's interesting that Fleury was almost sitting in between those two things. I'm wondering why that might be, and if you think that possibly could be because that's almost the first generations of a founding population. But I know your dates actually had some spread to them, but so did the runs of homozygosity. So I wonder if that matched the dates. So the earliest individuals having the highest runs.
Yeah, I showed the extreme, right, to show the striking that opposite between two. But basically, the more we go toward west, the more people are getting, like incomers are getting admixed or are getting in smaller community, or it seems that we have this run of homozygosity are getting higher. And the overall shape is changing slowly. So it's not only Fleury, it's something we can observe in different things. And this method is quite recent. I think we apply it for like maybe 2 years now, because it's just about technical issues with ancient DNA and missing data. So we have great colleagues working on the methodological aspects to make it possible. And so I think the more we will use it, the more we will have a very clear overview of the differences between the different groups, culture, time periods. But yeah, it's promising.
Okay, we have Francisca who is asking if the data used is available open access. Probably interested in that.
If it's DNA, it is. All what is published is accessible in some public repository site. So usually you have a number, accessing number at the end.
Understand it, though, isn't it? And the isotopic data that I referred to is all published with the exception of the Western Irish, which is in press.
Okay. So anybody else, do you have any question? You can type on the chat box or raise your hand and we'll give you a turn. If not, I will go for a question, even if it's a more cultural thing, not about genetics, but related, because I'm not a specialist in Neolithic period, but I would like to know your opinion about this concept of territoriality in the Neolithic, because it seems that there is an increasing territoriality, but at the same time, we can see these movements of Neolithic populations and the phenomena like in the case of Stonehenge, where we have people coming from different areas to meet together, which in my opinion is a way to exchange and share common ideas, also in terms of rituals, or this collective necropolis that Maïté was talking about, where there seemed to be not to be any common familiar component, but they are being buried in the same place. So do you think that there was more awareness of collective identity in that sense? What do you think about that?
I think with some of these, especially these large monumental sites, we're starting to see attempts at creating larger polities. So we're starting to see attempts, I hesitate to call them chiefdoms. I mean, that's a word that, you don't want to bandy about too much. A lot of people are very critical, but you're starting to see attempts to make these larger social units, and probably that sometimes those fall apart, but it's the building of those attempts which sort of bridge territoriality, but also expansion. I think that's the connecting, the thing that connects them. And especially when we're starting to talk now with the genetic evidence about elites. I mean, that word is, maybe we should rehabilitate the use of the word chiefdoms. I'm going to get in trouble if some of my colleagues hear me say that, probably.
Yeah. You, Maïté, what do you think about that? Do you have any...
From my knowledge, I think for now we do miss data to discuss it in detail. For me it gets to the big question of the resolution of what we can say or not yet, maybe. I think the more we will have a good network of data over a territory, and maybe we will be able to go more into solving discussing some of this question. And the paper, Rick, you showed before, but Cassidy and colleagues about Ireland, I think this is going towards this direction, with a great area, a big area covered, and connections that we can make in between, and then also between different possible social status, because of some monument connected to each other, but not with other type of monuments. And also, I remember there was also a question of diet. They have a different diet in between some groups or some monuments and others. So this is going where we have to go. But for these areas in France, I mean, we are working on it.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you. We have a question from Sarah. Sarah, if you want to ask.
Hi guys, thank you both for your really interesting and detailed talks. I'm just going to say I am also not a Neolithic person. I'm a Paleolithic person, so I apologize if this question is obvious to everyone. But you obviously had some people moving around, particularly people that later got buried in large monuments, so they were important to some extent. Do you also have long distance transport of like other rare materials or other rare artifact types that would suggest, group relationships if across territories, possibly?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we see these as in the Paleolithic, we see this in the Mesolithic, we see this in the Neolithic. Certain materials move, certainly. So this goes back to, I suppose, what I was talking about with the style zones, which is a little bit different than the movement of specific materials, but those show connections, but the nature of them is always unclear. I mean, sometimes you exchange things to distinguish yourself, because this group makes this and this group makes this, and then you can share them. Whereas everyone made the same thing, it would all be a little bit boring. So it's kind of a paradox as well, that you can distinguish groups by what they're by what they're sharing. So it actually ends up marking difference as well as being something that you share. But yeah, things like stone axes, some exotic materials, those probably increase as you go through time, but stone axes especially, they move all over the place. The famous example with Projet Jade a few years ago with green jadedite axes with origins in the Alps moving all across Europe.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not like they clearly track the evidence you're seeing in diets and strontium and DNA. It's a much bigger exchange network than that.
Yeah, it's pretty rare that all of the ducks sort of line up and tell the same story. They usually tell.
Wouldn't it be nice though?
Yeah, well, in a way, it's more interesting when there are these different scales. I think it's just a matter of moving back and forth between them.
Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I guess it also raises a question of biological exchanges and cultural exchanges, and what is the identity of each, and where do we go with that? And for what we know, for instance, for Europe during the Neolithic diffusion, we have different profiles from people belonging to the same cultural area. So we have some kind of non-adequation in between. So that's what is interesting to question now, I think. And again, with more data, I think we will have a much better resolution to discuss that. So.
Okay, thanks a lot.
So we have another question from Carlos. Carlos, if you want to open your micro.
Yes, hi, thank you for the presentations, Maïté and Rick. It was really interesting. I was wondering also about the sites in the Sado Valley, because they all are shell middens. And how can we relate that with the ones that lack a marine signal? Because as I recall, some of the bigger sites in terms of area are more upstream, curiously too. And also to the transition to the Neolithic, some shell middens do persist with some pottery, but no domesticates. So I think it would be interesting to discuss this. What do you think about it, Rick and Maïté, of course, if you also want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a problem all during the years I've been doing isotopic research. Someone will say that, well, we do have this evidence that they're eating fish or shellfish, but it comes down to how much of that diet it's making up. So the shells can accumulate very quickly. I don't know if you've been into the back of an oyster restaurant, and you can see the mountain of shells that pile up, and they preserve very well. So I think partly it's not making up enough of the diet. It's just a difference of amounts, so further down the coast in the lower Sado, they're just, and the shellfish will always be a relatively minor part of the diet usually compared to fish. You have to eat a lot of shells to get the same food value. So I think the shells are very visible archaeologically, but they quite often don't make up a large part of the diet. So yeah, I think that's about the best I can answer that. And the same with the Neolithic. It's it comes from being a major part of the diet in the Mesolithic, especially in places like Denmark, to a minor part of the diet that hardly shows up isotopically. And we always say if you eat fish once a week, it's not going to show up isotopically. You just have to have a little bit more than that.
Yes, thank you. That's interesting.
I didn't know that. It's interesting. The frequency of diet.
We have oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
No, it's just James is asking some interesting question. Do you want to ask James directly? Or?
Yeah, yes. So has anybody looked into dolmens and their appearance, and how are they connected to these early farmers and the spread from Iberia to British Islands and North France? Because the dolmens appear earlier, like say 7,000 years ago in Iberia, but then there is like a couple of thousand years hiatus before they show up in the British Islands. But clearly, I mean, seems to me that it's connected to early farming spread, because the spread of the dolmens follows the spread of the early farming. So would that be something interesting to look at when, studying this subsistence model and how these people lived? Would there be connection? I don't know.
I was about to reply about France only, and I mean, early farmers are much before some centuries before the first dolmens and monuments. But I have to confess, I don't really know.
Well, the first ones in Iberia are 7,000 years ago, and that's when the first farmers came also. So it seems, and also there is like pattern from Middle East and Anatolia with the dolmens appearing. So it seems to me quite clear that it's coming from with the spread of farming, although we don't know what they are for. We know that they all turned into some water, some river, but we don't know why they were built. But it seems to me that they are connected to farming, because they went here before the Mesolithic. It's only started in the Neolithic, after Neolithic.
Can I answer from the perspective of Northwest Europe? There are, Rick will, I hope, confirm this, that there are one or two very small dolmens in Britain that go back very early, but the main horizon of dolmen building is a little bit after the first farmers. And the same is true in Scandinavia, where there's a definite 300 or 400 year lag between the arrival of farming and the first dolmens going. Now, if you're in Scandinavia and you decide to build some kind of burial mound, why do you build the burial mounds like the ones that they're building in Iberia and France and Britain? There must be connections up and down that coast. So arguably, the dolmen phenomenon is more of an Atlantic facade kind of interaction than necessarily something linked with the spread of early farming as such, if that makes any sense.
Sure. Following the YDNA, the farmers, the R1B group, they came from Iberia upwards to British Islands.
But that's much later. That's during the Bronze Age. So
but wouldn't Bronze Age be also time of the dolmens? No.
We in the ancient DNA we are a bit struggling to make the proper connections. I mean, it's still a bit complicated for us to disentangle the different movements going to the British Islands. But we have one marker in the Y chromosome DNA. It's what we call H2 haplogroup, and this one has been found specifically in all the Mediterranean area from Anatolia to Iberia, and this one is found in central France, in Fleury, and then in Ireland. So we have here one marker showing that there is connection, but
there's also G2. G2 is also trouble.
This one is, yeah, but this one is coming from the Central Europe.
Anatolia, right?
Yeah. So we see different patterns, and the G2 it's not found in British Island, I think.
But
as far as I know, I think
it's from Armenia or something, or Georgia or something. Was born in.
That I don't know, but in the British and in Ireland islands, we specifically find this I2A something,
I2A,
Y chromosome haplogroup, and this one is inherited from the hunter-gatherers. So we don't know if the one we find in these isles is from the local hunter-gatherers or if it has been brought from the continent. So there's all the things. It's still we still have.
The I2 is also the prevalent in Scandinavia, so in Norway and all that. So that makes sense that they would.
That's also the one we find in southern France and in Iberia.
Exactly.
But so.
Interesting. It seems that there is so much work to be done still. We have two more questions. Niha, if you want to go first, I don't know if I'm pronouncing properly or not, sorry. And then we will go with Ross. Niha, Singh? No?
At least for reading the question, it's a very specific topic that I don't think I'm able to reply right now. We have a few individuals for these periods of time. I can put some reference in the chat if you want, and I know some papers are coming about that. It's very specific and maybe not linked to this discussion, I would say.
Yeah. So Ross, do you want to ask?
Hello, can you hear me? First time on my phone. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good. Thank you so much. This was really, really great. Like the way it was all set up about the big old question of like mobile farmers and sedimentary and hunter-gatherers. Brilliant. And I just wanted to know how much you think these dietary zones actually represent the diet, and how much are influenced by local ecologies and farming practices to an extent, because you could enrich nitrogen with manuring, and disturbance of forest soils would increase nitrogen, and then carbon in the whole forest. So just wondering your opinion.
Yeah, I mean certainly these are representing the foods that are being eaten, so it has to represent the local ecology. And the interesting, sometimes that's going to be quite obvious. So if you're on the stretches of a river that leads to the sea, the closer you are to the sea, the more access you will have to marine resources. And at some point there will be a boundary. But what I find really fascinating is how sharp these boundaries are, because there's no reason it had to be like that. These could be all, we usually think of hunting gathering communities as always sharing. So you share your food with the next group, that group shares its food with the next group, and this should give you a nice gradient, something like we were seeing with Maïté in a gradient of genetic relationships and ancestry. But yet with the boundaries, they're partly ecological, but then they're reinforced socially. So you have these communities that are just bedded in, and certain ways of doing things and certain ways of exploiting their landscape that just does not require them to be mobile. So they're mobile, but within a very limited territory. And what I find fascinating archaeologically is that those territories are stable for centuries and possibly even longer. And that becomes limitations of the data to find sites that extend, thousands of years. But it's like, once they find a way of doing things, they just keep doing it. And they don't really, yes, they change their adaptations, they evolve different toolkits. But in terms of how they exploit their landscape, they're bedded in, and this is what they do. Farmers bring the way of doing things with them, and it's a traveling show, and that's why they can move, and that's why farmers are mobile. They can take it with them, whereas hunter-gatherers fishing the river cannot take that with them, and so they stay there.
And I was wondering, just sorry to take up more of your time, how do you ever think we'll get to a point where we can identify some true cultural differences beyond sort of just general, sorry, being invaded, beyond just general sort of carbon and nitrogen signatures? Do you think with compound specific we'll be able to look at for amino acids, for profiles, and that sort of thing?
Yeah, we're able to do far more resolution all the time, whether it's with compound specific or whether it's with sequential sampling of teeth. This is something that I'm increasingly interested in now. We're doing a bit of this work in Britain to try to see whether the average signal that we can see in the bone collagen breaks down into something like a more seasonal difference of being on the coast for half the year and being inland for the other half of the year. So mobility within a constrained territory, or whether they're really just staying put and the food's coming to them. So I think that starts to say something about how subsistence is structured onto the landscape. I think we know the bigger picture to a certain extent, but there's all these little details that we're increasingly able to try to tackle. And with the DNA also, that Maïté has been talking about, the level of being able to identify the father and the son, when they made the barrow bigger to insert the son is fabulous. That's really, it's things we dream, it's things we made up a decade ago.
Yeah, indeed. But I have a question about your method then. Are you trying this serial sampling to have that like this signal over time on the same tooth, or are you trying this? Do you see something? Do you is it?
Yeah, we see all sorts of things. We haven't done it at any of the sites I've talked about today, but we've done it. We're doing it at Schwanneke, for example. In fact, Rowena Henderson and colleagues just had a paper accepted that's going to be out very soon. And we see sub-annual resolution. So, and that paper is, we're getting about 12 samples per tooth. We now can do 18 or 20. So we're much less, sometimes I think even 3 samples a year. So you're starting to be able to get a seasonal dietary signal, a crude one, because carbon and nitrogen, they only tell you certain things. But anywhere where you're using marine or aquatic resources, it works really well. With farmers, we are trying it, but what we're looking for almost is the failure of farming when they go back to using marine resources. So we're interested to see if we can pick that up in some coastal sites. Janet Montgomery did a wonderful study where they found this, but it was in Shetland. So farming failing in Shetland is maybe not that surprising. So we're trying to see this, if we can find this in southern Britain as well.
And have you tried on the strontium for this variations? Seasonal
in my own work, no, but I know some really interesting papers are just coming out now from some Scandinavian sites where they're doing, I think it's laser ablation, and they're getting really fine detail of
oh, nice. Could you put the reference here?
Yeah. It'll give me a second.
That sounds really cool. Okay, nice.
Yeah, also Harry is sharing a preprint that may be of our interest in population genomics of Stone Age Eurasia, just for your interest. It's in the link is in the chat. I don't know if there is any other question. James, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I was just asking for more details. You mentioned that these hunter-gatherer groups, they would trade with each other, sort of. But wouldn't it be like sort of hunter-gatherer groups would trade with the farmer groups instead of like hunter-gatherer groups trading with each other?
Yeah.
So there would be like sort of surplus from hunting, and they would trade that with hunters. So that would be going on instead of hunter-gatherer groups trading or farmer groups trading with each other. Sort of.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this depends on the arrival of the farmers. So prior to that, they were only exchanging amongst themselves. And probably the clearest evidence we have for that, it's quite patchy to find this direct evidence. First of all, it's quite time limited. And one of the really interesting things with the ancient DNA is the way that hunter-gatherer ancestry comes back in the Middle Neolithic. That was kind of unexpected. It's almost like where are they hiding on the landscape? But Peter is, if he's still here, there's really nice evidence from Denmark of farming things that are associated with farmers, including particular types of stone axes, moving beyond the boundaries of the farming communities into where the hunter-gatherers still are. But in other places, like in Britain, I can't point to a single convincing example of that kind of thing. And it's partly because we don't have the stratigraphic resolution of settlement sites. So that's always a bit of a barrier to what we can say about those sorts of connections that we know must have happened. But they're quite frustrating to get a handle on.
Sure. Yeah, it was because the Sado area, if you go north from the river, there was more farming, but towards south there is more fishing. So it would make sense that population near the Sado would trade with the farmers up north, and sort of, so they wouldn't cross these boundaries.
I just see that Harry has uploaded one of the papers I was thinking of with the laser ablation on the strontium.
Yeah. Thanks. That's really cool.
Thanks, Harry.
So I think there are no more questions. So we are gonna finish now. Yeah, thank you. Ross is saying thank you and apologize. So thank you, Rick and Maïté, for all these inspiring dialogue. Thank you so much. And just don't forget to join us next month on June 24th for our last session of 2022 ICArEHB Dialogues on Migrations and Dispersals, where we are going to talk about archaeological migration narrative with Daniela Hoffman from the University of Bergen and Antonio Varela from ICArEHB Company and ICArEHB. For this occasion, the convener will be our colleague Carlos Simões. Thank you very much for your attention and see you then.